In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Allie, Meeres.
And I'm Byng, Giraud.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
Welcome to the Primary Risk podcast for summer 2025. Just Byng and I today. Byng, how's your summer going?
It's good. I'm operating out of our world headquarters in beautiful Winlaw, British Columbia.
Tell the listeners where Winlaw is located.
It's the epicenter of Canada.
Oh yeah? Is it our economic hub?
Winlaw is a village. It's not even incorporated, about 40 minutes north of the city of Nelson or the city of Castlegar, where I was born. And they have a beautiful river and a beautiful valley. I don't really want to tell people really much more about where it is because I don't want any more people to come.
All right. So you're just like everyone else in Canada.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, that sounds lovely. I've been hiding out in Ontario, as you know, for part of the summer, enjoying the fishing and the sunshine. And I just can't get enough. But I'm still not winning the family fishing derby.
Well, the great thing this summer in British Columbia is no significant wildfires down certainly in the south, and that's been a really big deal. We've had enough moisture and still a lot of sunny days, and so we're still allowed to actually have campfires in the southeast of British Columbia right now. Normally, we get a fire ban on July 1st, so it's been a good summer.
That's really important. I mean, no wildfires, and also for marshmallow, enthusiasts like myself, it's important to be able to go and have a campfire if I'm going to camp out. Awesome. Okay, so this summer has not only been warm in weather, but it has been heating up on the government front. So today, you and I are going to walk through Ottawa's sweeping new powers under Bill 5. We're also going to talk about BC and Bill 15. We are going to talk about...
And Ontario with their C5, so 2 5s and a 15. I'm not sure what the significance of that number is, but...
Guess we'll find out today. Also, the PMO announced his new major projects office.
Yes, I have to sort of comment on that. So the new major projects office will formally be launched on the 1st of September of this year. The Prime Minister made a big deal of it. This is a way to integrate project reviews and to accelerate them and to sort of break the morass or the logjam that we've faced as Canadians. We talk about on this podcast all the time. But I had to pull out an old press release.
And an old napkin.
So an old press release. This is a press release from October 1st, 2007, which is when the Harper government announced Canada's new major project management office. So, what did I say? 18 years ago, almost within a month, another government tried this major project concept. And so, we'll talk a little bit about why that didn't work and whether or not it'll work this time. I do actually have, this is sort of weird, they actually had cocktail napkins printed out at the opening party. It was a cocktail party launching the major projects office back in 2007.
As you do in Ottawa.
And I kept one of these cocktail napkins because it had stamped on it, project approved. And I thought, well, I'm going to keep this. And the minister signed it. Now that I remember, Meeres has signed it. Minister Gary Lunn at the time. And I thought, okay, well, I'll have him sign this. And if I ever need a project approved, I'll just walk in with this cocktail napkin and say, see, you've already approved my project. So, we've gone from, cocktail napkin approvals to, filling a whole room full of documents to get a project approved. So, yeah.
How the times have changed, but how they've stayed the same.
So
we're going to talk about that. We're also going to touch on Minister Hodgson. He's been touring the country. He recently commented on LinkedIn about his first 70 days in office. Days?
I don't know why 70. He should have been 50 or 5.
Maybe he loves the number 7 for 70 days.
But he did say some cool things.
He did.
I thought he specifically mentioned carbon capture and storage, which was a little controversial and probably wasn't fully embraced by the previous Liberal regime. So it's interesting that we're seeing those projects, and it's probably with reference to the Pathways Alliance, which is the big project in Alberta. But it's interesting that the minister himself is specifically singling that out. So that's notable.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So we're going to talk a bit about that. But why don't we get into it?
Okay.
So let's first talk about these bills. I want to start with why. Why are we seeing two provinces and the federal government launching these bills?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. because one could argue, I think there's a broad consensus in this country that we've reached a point where our regulatory and approval processes on large projects, major industrial projects, major infrastructure projects, are, to use a word, sclerotic, right? Our process is frozen. Projects are taking far too long. They're costing far too much money. They're getting more and more into level of detail with actually not really much any greater return in terms of benefit to Canadians or the environment or to our economy. So I understand. What I'm not really sure about, and probably other than politics, but I'm not really sure about is why you simply couldn't go to maybe some of your existing legislation and reform that, fix what you have. Why do you need another piece of legislation? And we have a guess, and you can...
Political. I mean, they need to make... It's a time where you need to make a political statement.
There's nothing sexy about repealing legislation.
No, it doesn't make the headlines.
Sexy to me.
Yeah, well, we're kind of weird people. So it's not sexy. And at a time, I think, when there's just an exorbitant amount of pressure on these provinces and the federal government to show that they are going to do things and they're taking action, I think they felt like they needed to make this big wave, but they rushed it. I think all the Ontario, Ford, EB, and BC, and Carney to an extent, although his came a bit later, rushed it. And I mean, I want to talk a bit about how we would have done things maybe a little bit differently if you were premier, for example.
Well, I mean, let me be fair though. I mean, I welcome the sentiment that this is brought about. It is nigh time that we realize that the primary economic generators in this country are not the government. The last 10 years, I think there was an element in Ottawa that believed otherwise, and maybe in Victoria. There's a recognition that the true economic generator of an economy must be the private sector, must be private sector investment, and a recognition as a country like Canada that often comes from these large-scale natural resource projects. So I welcome the sentiment. I actually welcome those pieces of legislation. I welcome the mood they've created, and I welcome the window, although I believe it's going to be a narrow window, of a consensus in this country amongst almost everybody that we've got to change direction, and we actually have to encourage some economic development. So I do welcome that. Where it gets a little more confusing is, sort of jumping to those announcements without really the context. We know what the impediments are, and in particular when it comes to Indigenous peoples and First Nations, not really having done their homework, and frankly setting off maybe a little bit of a firestorm unnecessarily with our Indigenous partners, sort of almost implying that their issues, their concerns, their rights and title would be disregarded. I don't think that was the intent, maybe by some people, but I don't think it was the intent. But it certainly came out that way, and then of course it created a controversy, and probably unnecessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. And our good friend at McMillan Insurancing actually did a podcast following the release of Bill 5. And, she rightly commented that when it comes to, the way that consultation is happening, it would be in line with the current IAC legislation federally. She can't comment on the province because the provincial legislation was slightly different. But at the federal level, it was the same. And so I think, you and I have talked about this. It's more the context. It's why were there some leaders not spoken to that already have projects in place that could have been there to talk about, this is how it's going to work. There could have just been a bit more.
I think this is going to be one of our themes today, is about people. And I think you and I were talking earlier that some of this is sort of an HR problem. If there's a number of projects that the federal government thinks really need to be accelerated, or the provincial government in British Columbia really think they need to be accelerated, or Ontario or any other province, it's a finite list. And governments are large. They have lots of people. They've got lots of smart people. I don't understand why those nations in whose territories in which those projects are located couldn't have been reached out in advance. We saw it in British Columbia sort of in spades when one of the projects on the Premier's list was the Eskay Creek gold mine in Tahltan territory. And the Tahltan, because they actually have a standing agreement with the government as to how this project will be permitted, rightly so said, wait a minute, we have a process and you don't get to go around that. It probably wouldn't have taken much to get the Tahltan to stand with the Premier when the bill was being announced, by making sure that, we're not going to go around the Tahltan. Doing these things unilaterally and not having reached out to those nations is what's created this negative sentiment. You can change the legislation all you want, but much of this is a result of court cases since the Constitution was changed in 1982. There is Indigenous rights and title. Some of it is not fully understood, or there's still court cases to be had, I suppose, or still agreements to be met. But we have to recognize this exists, and simply changing some legislation or bringing out some new legislation doesn't make that go away. So I'm a little surprised with our federal and provincial governments for not realizing that perhaps before they threw a bunch of projects on a list that they didn't talk to those nations specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in BC. That was an interesting story that we saw play out. And I think federally we saw it more with AFN and some of the meetings that were had this month.
It's complicated.
Yep.
I was talking to somebody the other day who's not sort of in our space, and he said, well, why didn't they, talked about the role of the AFN? Don't they represent? I said, no, the Assembly of First Nations has a very important role in representing First Nations on many of their issues, but they don't actually represent those nations. They can't negotiate for them. They're not the title holder as in the parlance. If you want to talk about, let's talk about a mine in the middle of Saskatchewan, you've got to talk to the nation in whose territory that mine resides, or nations, if it could be several. The AFN has a role, but it's really this more broad public policy rights and title debate. They can't advocate for a project. They can't say, we as First Nations support this mine. They don't have that authority. Mm-hmm. You have to go to that individual nation or nations. So again, created a conflict. AFN had to respond. That probably could have been resolved by bringing in those nations, some nations that had projects directly and including them on the announcement.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, pivoting a bit from the Indigenous side of the legislation, let's spend a bit of time talking about the pros and cons of these types of bills to the major project sector. So bills come in like this. How does this impact the major project sector, both from building things and wanting to build things and the investment side? Let's talk through that.
Well, they sent a great signal, right? So we talked about the politics of this. That's why you do this stuff. It's a great signal. There's a mood in the country, positive. But the devil's in the detail, right? Like I said, there was another major project office announced 18 years ago. And here we are 18 years later, and we're still struggling with these issues. Unless there's, unless a more specific approach to how these things are implemented, they're going to be problematic. You can't just say we're going to go around other pieces of legislation, or we're going to expedite these projects without understanding all the things you're going to have to deal with. But at an even more fundamental level than saying, we're going to have a project office that's going to advocate for projects, is that what's missing are the actual people to do those projects. So, you and I were just doing some AI Googling before this. There are 36 roughly operating mines in Ontario. Most of those mines have expansion plans. You don't need to create a big project office to help those mines with their permits and expansion. What you need is a deputy minister to know the names of those mine managers off the top of his head or her head, and know their phone numbers, and probably call them on a monthly basis and understand what their needs and project issues are. We seem to be obsessed with creating a whole new process. And again, I do welcome some of the sentiment. We're creating a whole new process where, frankly, just dedicating more people and the right people to these projects is probably just as important as changing the process, changing the legislation. Doesn't matter how good your process is, without the right people bringing those things forward, it's not going to work.
Well, the con is exactly that, right? I think it's the fact that we are saying the process is what needs to change, when in fact, maybe it's not the process that needs to change. Actually, at the federal level, the IAA and its current, involvement has been pretty good. We have had a couple projects, a handful of projects move through it. And actually they've moved through it pretty quickly. We at Woodfibre moved through it pretty quickly.
Under the old legislation, our impact assessment took less than 2 years.
And it really maybe isn't the process that's the problem. It's the people sometimes, and people feeling empowered to make decisions within government and have those personal relationships. I think we've really abdicated that power away from everyone within government. People don't feel like I can have this relationship with the mine manager. I can call them. I can actually advocate for these issues that they're having within government.
And I can understand them.
Yeah, it's always just wanting to perhaps pass that risk on to someone else.
Well, we sort of created two examples for which the solution is exactly the same. Why weren't nations part of those announcements federally or provincially? Because nobody took the time to call those 10, 15, whatever nations and say, hey, we're going to talk about your project. Do you want to be on stage with us, or do you care, or whatever, right? 15 phone calls in British Columbia, right? And then we just talked about, the projects that are trying to expand. So we've talked about nations, now we're talking about projects. 36 mines in Ontario. What did we think? 20 metal type mines in Quebec, 17 approximately in British Columbia. There is no reason that the expansions, and because all of them want expansions and have additional mine life, well, almost all of them, I'm sure, that we couldn't help those with their projects and their permits and moving ahead and creating the expansion in the economy that we're actually looking for, simply by having people more dedicated to servicing those specific projects. I mean, 17 mines in British Columbia. If you're the minister, or you're the deputy minister, or you're a senior civil servant, you should probably know the names of every mine manager of those 17 mines off by heart. I'm not sure that happens. So we're not dedicating teams, people to these problems. We're only dedicating process.
Okay, since we're jumping to it already, let's talk about the major.
I apologize.
Let's talk about the major projects office. You touched on it a bit with the napkin anecdote. Love that. Hodgson wrote his LinkedIn post. We talked a bit about that, but this office is going to be stood up. So, it needs to be about the people. So if we have this office stood up, what powers does this office need to have? And what powers do the people within the office ought to have? How would you structure it to make this office work to actually get, say, 5 or 10 projects built in our country?
Well, I would start with giving it some regulatory authority. Now that's easy to say, but I think one of the failures of the 118 years ago was it basically had a series of MOUs with the departments by which it would work with them. But those departments still had statutory authorities and still had regulatory, like they had to satisfy their legislation. So the MPMO of the time, or the MPO of the time, couldn't overrule them. They were the junior partner, as it were. They were simply a coordinating body. Great people there. The objectives, again, were the same, but they were simply a coordinating body, simply an advocate, a handholder. They couldn't go into the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and say, you shall. The power still existed with those line ministries and their legislation and their regulatory obligations. So if it's going to be a player, it's got to have the power to be a player. So that's one. Number one.
And I don't even think it needs to be you going into DFO and saying you shall, but instead going into DFO and saying your job is to help this company figure out a solution and how they can get this project built. Instead of now what we find, and we deal with DFO for a number of our clients, is there's a lot of issues and it's put back on the proponent to, a very ambiguously.
You might have your impact assessment or your EAO certificate already, but then you've got a series of other regulatory
and it's confusing and complicated. So
this is where projects get slowed down. It's not the impact assessment itself.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a bit about that. But okay, so number one, regulatory authority.
You need some strength, right? You need a bit of oomph.
You need to be pumping the iron in the morning.
Yeah. Oomph. Okay. But what I really feel, and again, because we're not talking about a huge list of projects in any of these contexts, we don't know what the Prime Minister's office is going to come up with their priority projects. We do know a lot of the Premier's lists. We've seen them already. They're not long. Given the number of civil servants we have in this country, given the number of civil servants in these departments, I would find the best and the brightest, and I would assign them to specific projects. And frankly, I might even look outside to bring those people in and say, you're here for a good time, not a long time. You're going to come in, you're going to help this mine, this power line, get to its successful, to a shovel in the ground. That's your job. You're here for this period of time, and then you can go do something else. This is not a career. This is a project. And one of the reasons we like the work we do is you come in, you do the project, you get a success, move on to the next thing. And that spirit is probably missing from long-term sort of regulatory agencies, right? Because they don't see themselves as that. They're here to regulate. They're here to manage a rule. This is a whole different thing. So you need an entirely different mentality. And the people you bring in, not only do they need a different mentality, they need a different culture. They're going to need a level of emotional intelligence and a level of confidence that they can make decisions and develop those one-on-one relationships, which will take me to my third thing, is you should be very specific to your project. So I bring Allie Meeres in to work on the X mine in northern Manitoba. That's your project. You and your team, 5 other people, 10 other people, whatever it is, that's all you do. You don't have 10 other things that are distracting you. When I call you as I'm the mine manager of the company, you're there, or if you're on holiday, I know who else to call. None of this, I'm lost in the morass of government. You have to be, I would dedicate those people to the project for the life of the project. True project teams, assigned individuals, not 10 files, one file. And we have enough people in government, frankly, I think you could do that. And give them that kind of mandate and that kind of power.
And give them a healthy travel budget so that they
Get
can
in your truck.
Get in the truck or get on a fly-in, fly-out plane if you're working in a mine site in northern Manitoba and go at least once a month, if not more, to see actually what's happening on the ground. Because again, and I think we've lost this in general, we're not exposed enough to what's actually happening on the ground. We know this with our mining clients. You go up, you visit the mine, you learn 100% more than what you would have if you stayed at home.
You shouldn't be in charge of regulating a project you've never seen.
Exactly. You have to physically see it. I mean, we had Jeff Stibbert on the podcast. He really hammered that home, right? You have to physically know how to problem solve, even if it's an exploration project. I mean, Melanie and I were just up at an exploration project last week. I understand that project so much more now that I've driven and walked the site. So I do think that's a part of it. And
healthy travel budget. So that's number 4. Okay.
Number 4, a healthy travel budget. But that's really important, right? Because we do see with government rollback of budgets that sometimes that gets taken away.
The right people probably you don't need huge staff. The right people can do these things. But, I don't want to get into the micromanagement of this, but let's just remove those mining guys out there, the power line guys out there, and reverse for the private sector saying, Ottawa is some faceless, amorphous thing to rail against. No, Ottawa is not Ottawa. Ottawa is not, the government. Ottawa is not, that bureaucrat. Ottawa is, civil, deputy minister or senior director, Allie Meeres. I have her phone number. I know who to call when I have a problem. We can have a mature, grown-up discussion. That's bringing emotional intelligence and effective HR to the problem. And I think, just to reiterate this, we obsess with process. Let's create the perfect process. And we forget that it's actually about people. In this company, I'm going to rant a bit. It's really, no matter how good of human resource policies I have or how my operating policies are in a binder or my business plan, if I don't have the right people, it's not going to work. And the deals, we've done some really innovative, exciting deals with First Nations in this company, things I'm really proud of. But that didn't come from the fact that I had a good process. Frankly, there was no process.
I was going to say, do we have a business plan or a HR policy?
What we had was goodwill and emotional intelligence and a willingness to work with our partner, right? And then on the other side, with those nations we did those deals with, similar circumstances. It really came down to the individuals. The process was almost irrelevant. In some cases, there wasn't a process. It was people coming together to find a solution. So maybe this isn't about legislation or process. Maybe this is about good HR and emotional intelligence.
I completely agree, Byng. I mean, I really think that this Major Projects Office could be a tool for government to help major projects move forward. However, it's really not about the way in which it works and more about the people that they put in the office and the power that they're able to give them. And that is what will make it successful, or what potentially has the ability to make it unsuccessful if not done properly.
Well, and then to be sort of critical of some of the private sectors, like repeal or modify Bill C-69, the so-called anti-pipeline bill. Well, you could do that, and maybe that would help. But again, that's not really the solution. No matter how nice a process you made, if the right people are not involved in the process, it will not work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good point. We're not going to talk about C-69 because that's not what we're focused on today. Another day.
Hakuna Matata. It's in the past.
We had Jason Kenney on our last podcast, so that came up enough. Okay, so I do want to touch on a bit more about the pros and cons. So we've talked about the Major Projects Office. We've talked a bit about the bills, but pros and cons of the bills, 2 more things. 1, does it open up a winners and losers list for how does that impact the major project sector? Are companies thinking, I want to be on that list, or are they thinking, I don't want to be on that list, and why?
Well, I'm going to put it back on you because we were talking about this earlier, and you had sort of better answer. Like, do I want to have a target on me?
I really think that if you are a government lobbyist or you are a government relations person, love GR people, by the way, you are looking for your project or your company that you're consulting to be on that list. And then I think everyone else in the company is saying, no, I don't want to be in that list, because it does open you up to attack from ENGO groups. It opens you up to attack from, other groups within your province that you're operating.
Well, there's a microscope on you now.
Yeah, and you're having to do things in a different way. And you maybe as a company who has maybe invested hundreds of millions of dollars already into a project have just wrapped your head around the process in which you're going to be going through, and then suddenly you're moving through a new process that actually you're still kind of figuring out.
You're very right. I mean, there's going to be a lot of people who think they want on the list, but I think there's probably going to be just as many people as just, you know what, I'll lay low on this one.
Yeah, I'll take a pass.
Yeah.
We saw that with a couple of our clients when the BC list came out. I think we had the unhappy ones and the happy ones, and it really was dependent on, I think, what stage of a project they were in, and the type of company that they were, of course. One final thing to touch on this, and I would really love to hear your opinion, is controversial opinion here. I actually don't think the IAA, so Bill 5 that was enacted federally, basically allows projects to move from the stage of the IAA review where it's should the project even be going ahead, straight to the project is going ahead and let's go through an environmental assessment. However, I actually don't think, we talked about this earlier, that the environmental assessment process is that bad. I think it's actually pretty straightforward. I think companies are moving through it pretty well. I think it's the before and the after. I mean, there's a reason that we have made these certificates 10 years. It's because that is how much time it takes to move through all the other permitting, all the other paperwork, the preparation to actually build your project. So I actually don't think that our focus should be on the IAA. I think it needs to be on the pre and the post.
If we look at some of the time frames for projects that have received their certificate, they actually aren't that bad. But that's if we look at that in isolation.
Right.
If you look at from the idea of from concept to shovel in the ground, that's when you get these much longer time periods. You may have a certificate and you may not proceed. The conditions may be too onerous. The economy may have changed. Lots of other things happen in that time change. And I know from other projects we've worked on, the management plans and the ancillary permits were always, frankly, more onerous in many respects because they were all over the place than the IAA process, which was in a central agency. In some respects, it was easier because you kind of knew who you were dealing with. Then you get into this other thing, I'm regulated by DFO, I'm Transport Canada, Provincial Ministry of, Land and Water. I've got to go to all these places to coordinate to get my shovel, and they all have enforcement abilities. And so it can be that it's the other parts that get complicated, which is, again, if you want to talk about your major project office, it's not really about the window of the environmental assessment. It's from the moment you decide to move forward with your project to the shovel in the ground. You need somebody to hold your hand the whole way.
The whole way. I really think it's a full picture, and that is actually where projects fall off, right? We see lots of projects actually get environmental certificates in this province and in this country. It is whether or not they can then move into an actual construction phase that is difficult. And if you take that one step further and you look at, okay, well, we need to go market investment back into Canada, there needs to be that confidence there, right? Mm-hmm. Because big sophisticated companies, Petronas as an example, they've come to Canada, they've tried to invest here heavily and have been, sent back out in some ways. I know they're still here and they're still doing great things in Northern British Columbia right now. However, if we look at how to bring that capital back, we are going to have to create some certainty to those sophisticated international buyers that we're not just going to take you through the IAA period. We're going to take you from the beginning all the way to the end, and we're going to make sure that this project moves forward.
And as we discussed, why? Why is that also important? Because, an old adage about environmental assessment or impact assessment was that you come in with about 30% engineering, 30% design. Why? Because you're early stage and you're trying to find out if I'm not going to spend all this money if I don't know the project can proceed. I'm looking for red flags in the impact assessment. I'm not looking for all the detail. So then I get my certificate and then, okay, now I need to move something here or I need to adjust this. And you get amendments or you get other additional permits. There's a whole additional process. We saw the funny one was wood fiber, right? Mm-hmm. Tell that story.
Oh, well, I was just telling you earlier today, I got a call from my father This was about last year, right when they were trying to build their flotel. And for those of you who aren't read into the wood fiber project and didn't live it for 4 years, in the original environmental certificate, they planned for a workforce accommodation on land camp. Now, ironically, this was asked for by the District of Squamish at the time of the environmental certificate. So they said, we want people to live in the community. We want them to buy groceries. We want them to come to the bars. Like, we want them to be mountain biking on the weekends. So in the environmental certificate, wood fiber put, we're going to do a man camp on land. Then time goes by, as we just discussed, we get the environmental certificate, but time goes by. And years later, you have a group of councillors and a mayor who vehemently oppose pretty much having workers anywhere in the community. And they had to go for a major amendment, which I really think this is something that needs to be considered. They go for a major amendment. Well, the community also opposes them having a flotel at site where they would literally boat workers out. They'd go get onto
Never
the flotel.
touch the community, never spend a nickel,
which is what they're asking for. And they would put them on the flotel. They'd work there a couple weeks. They'd go off. They'd be boated back to Vancouver. And this was the solution that they had come up with to serve the municipality. And by the way, this is a provincially, federally, and Squamish Nation environmentally approved project. But the municipality fought the District of Squamish so hard and worked so hard against them on this concept of a flotel that it made the newspaper. They were prohibiting the project from moving forward.
Down, and the province had to step in.
They're probably losing millions of dollars a day because they were now behind on construction. Of course, my father calls. He says, "Why is that flotel not happening?" I had to explain to him that, I don't know. I'm not working on the project anymore. But it is because the province has given municipalities the ability to scope creep on these major projects.
Well, not just municipalities, right? That's part of it. Like, the products do change. Then you're forced into a project amendment. So it's, this ongoing process before you actually, again, to get to the shovel. It's not simply the impact assessment. You have to get through it all. I think that it's just an example of you again, they had a federal certificate, they had a provincial certificate, they had the first Indigenous-led environmental assessment in Canada, and still
couldn't get that flotel built.
We're dragged into another process.
Yeah.
So if you're going to build a major projects office and you're going to support these sort of things, you need to look at it holistically from beginning to end.
Yeah.
It does raise another issue, though, is like, what is the role of the MPMO or the MPO versus the IAA, or is it the same thing? And I think there's been some discussion about that. And I don't know what the Prime Minister and his team are going to have this thing look like. But I am against the notion of a passive organization. And when I say passive, means like, I bring you my project and you just wait for me to bring it. And you give me some advice, and I essentially am thrown into the whims of the regulatory process. I think it's passive is bad because, particularly for foreign companies that are coming here, they actually need help. I think the MPO should actually be holding the hand of the and actually be an advocate and a solution finder for the project in the face of the complexity of government. That, I think, would allow those regulatory agencies on the other side to do their vigorous work. At the same time, the proponent still feels there's somebody helping them move through the process. The day of, good luck with the process. Welcome to Canada. Good luck with the process. Thanks for bringing your project. Good luck. We'll see if you get out the other end. That day has to be over, because the success rate and the time frame is the success rate is low. The time frame is long. This is why we're losing investment in projects. That's why we have the problem we have today. We can't be passive anymore. The system is too complex. I am not going to come all the way from Malaysia with my billions of dollars anymore and spend billions to figure out your bloody system when I can use my money somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So if you want me to come and build your whatever, your mine, your pipeline, your power line, your green energy project, maybe you need to help me understand the system. And I don't just mean the permits I need. How does it work with Indigenous peoples? How does it work with non-Indigenous peoples? What are the culture and customs? Again, back to the HR and the emotional intelligence. I think the MPO has to be an advocate organization. There are plenty of other regulators. They're doing that job already, but it's gotten too complex and too hard to the point where, like, again, in the fluidity of money around the world, I can go to Canada and get into a complex morass and never see the end of it, or I can go somewhere else and spend my money. And you know what? I'm gonna. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and also, I don't know. We're talking about federal. We keep going back and forth between federal and provincial, but at the federal level, it can be quite straightforward. But then you go to provincial permitting. you still have to go through a whole process within the province. So it's not
complex.
straightforward. It's complex. And I think one of the big challenges of the office is going to be how they work with provinces on some of these projects. I mean, you can very well say, we're going to build a pipeline from Alberta to BC, and you could go, find a company that wants to invest money and say, we're going to take you through this process at the federal level, hold your hand all the way through to construction. You still have to have a premier that's okay with that happening and isn't going to throw up a bunch of roadblocks for you.
Which has worked in some places.
Yeah, it's worked, but that is going to be, I think, one of the challenges.
I mean, in British Columbia, we have what's called a substituted process. So the federal government can delegate or substitute provincial regulatory systems for their federal obligations. And we've seen that work mostly on point-on-the-map projects, like a mine or a clean energy project, like in a specific place. Linear projects, it's been way harder. But yeah, I mean, again, we're in a federal system. Resources are owned by the provinces, but the environment is sort of a shared responsibility. It wasn't defined in the Constitution. Indigenous peoples belong under the federal side of the Constitution. And then you get these other sort of things you wouldn't expect. Migratory birds. If I want to deal with toads and bats, I deal with the province. If I'm dealing with migratory birds, I deal with the feds. So you start to get into those complex things. And so why you would need, you need more than just a passive agency. You need good people. I got this vision of this, I was telling you earlier, this sort of strike force. They come in their helicopter, they rappel out, and we're here to help you, and we're going to get this project done, and when we're done, we're going to get out of here, right?
The SWAT team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what sort of envision what's required, because a passive approach, throwing people into the sort of the morass of the regulatory system, not understanding the complexities of our system, and particularly when it comes to Indigenous people, has proven to be a recipe for failure.
Okay. So, Byng, how can we get big things done in this country beyond these bills? We've talked about the Major Projects Office. We've talked about Bill 5 and Bill 15 here in BC. But beyond these bills, what needs to change in the long term?
Well, I think one of the concerns with the bills, we've talked about this, is these lists. So we kind of need something for everybody else, right? Whatever project you're proposing should have a chance, sort of its day in court, even if it's not high profile enough or attractive enough or sexy enough to be on one of these lists. So we need to create systems that all projects can proceed, even small ones that perhaps are not significant enough even to enter an impact assessment. That has to go with I think the big thing of that is back to our whole solution about better attention to those individual projects by the right people in a properly structured project office with the right team. Again, the whole sort of strike team concept. I think those people have to be available for everybody. If you're getting to smaller and smaller projects and to the longer list, you do have to change some process, right? You do have to remove some of the encumbrances of some of the regulatory regimes that are slowing people down. But probably some big successes will create the interest and create the sort of investment climate that will benefit the smaller projects. So the big project successes will help. But if you're going to deal with smaller projects, it's as much an HR issue as it is. At that level, you're going to have to fix process.
I agree. I mean, we can't just create new legislation. We do have to go and look at existing legislation and really have an honest conversation with ourselves about what was the reason we had to bring in the new legislation to start with, and start working backwards and figuring out some solutions to the existing legislation, because, there'll only be a certain amount of projects that are selected. In BC, we already know what those are. Federally, we're going to hear what those are, but what about everyone else? And I think to the early stage, if we think about mining, for example, we hear a lot of rhetoric about critical minerals, the need to have more critical minerals. Well, our mineral exploration sector is hurting in BC in particular, and in other provinces. And having a real conversation about how to have the right people in those offices to support these early projects before an EA is even entered into is really important.
Yeah, it's difficult to give direction to if you're listening and you're a potential proponent. It's difficult for us to give direction as to sort of how to start. But I think if we see some successes with some of these larger projects, and we start to see some successes, that'll create the mood that will encourage more investment. But again, the danger also is, never mind the target on the back. We talked about the big projects with target on the back. The danger is that those projects become the obsession of the regulators to the detriment of all the smaller guys. So you're not on the list, you don't get any of my attention. Right? So I think governments need to look back at themselves, and this is again to government to solution, and say, I do need to fix the process for everybody else. It can't just be about the low-hanging fruit of the sexy project. I do need to fix the process more broadly. That may take more time.
Yeah.
Right.
More time and more resources. And back to your point with the major projects office, hiring the right people into those offices and giving them the right authority to feel like they can develop relationships and know that they can talk to a proponent in a way where they can advocate for them.
One of the things the private sector often says is timelines. And I agree, timelines would be nice. Timelines bring discipline, but a timeline can always be put aside. It's government, right? They can do that. So you're still going to need to make sure you're empowering strong government decision makers who understand the client, understand who they're working with, and understand their individual problems, because they still could set the time aside. If there's something so insurmountable, yes, the clock will have to be stopped. There's no such thing as legislation that will have a clock that can't be stopped by somebody.
Absolutely. I also think beyond these projects that are selected, we need to create some targets. Right? We need to create some targets for how many projects we should be building. We need to create some targets for how much we should be producing, because by doing so, that does enable investment. We've seen that work proactively and negatively in our country. Politicians get up, they say, we want to have a hydrogen economy, or we want to have a wind economy, or we want to build more pipelines. That impacts investment. That impacts major project companies saying, oh, we're going to go invest some time and resources into this province or this country. So we do need to also think about setting some of those targets to signal again to some of our other friends.
You could, to the credit of Christy Clark, who was premier a couple of premiers ago in British Columbia, she did set some specific targets about new mines opened, mine expansion, and certainly LNG exports. Most of those goals were not hit, but that didn't diminish the value of having set those goals. If you don't have a goal, you're never going to reach it anyway. So if I say, we want to export X pounds of copper, or we want to open X more mines, or we want X expansions on the mining side, we want to export X BTUs, million BTUs of natural gas. Setting those targets does send a good message to the investment community and to the companies that are looking at Canada. When LNG was hot and heavy in British Columbia, part of that was government really saying, we want to open a whole bunch of these things, and they came.
But now in 2025, 12 years later, we're realizing the success. That's how long it has taken.
There was a leader of this country who did say there was no business case. Well, yesterday, or the day before yesterday, the Americans agreed to $750 billion worth of exports. So, stop picking winners and losers.
When you create targets, though, this is really good, and this is a detail, but when you say we want to have, say, 10 mines open, say 10 mines. Don't say 10 critical minerals mines or 10 copper mines. It's important that we do set goals, but also let the market decide which projects should go forward.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Allie, is in mining in particular, most of these mines are polymetallic anyway, so gold is what's keeping some of these critical minerals mines actually on top,
and
right?
Gold ain't a critical mineral.
Yeah, it's because they're copper gold mines, and the gold's actually making the mine profitable so they can sell the copper. So don't overprescribe. But broad goals are useful. Broad goals, that's what government is for, to set the broad goals, not to get into the weeds and decide how companies should make their investment or where they should make an investment. It's like, we want to do this. None of the critical mineral strategies in Canada that I've seen really say X target. They want to encourage critical minerals. These are the minerals we want to go after, but why not say, I need 10 more copper mines? Why not say, I want to export this much more natural gas? Why not say, we need 2 new uranium mines? Why not say, we're going to expand our potash exports by X percent? Choose some targets. We have enough smart people in government that could actually set those targets. If they're not achievable, well, firstly, they shouldn't be stretch goals. They should be achievable goals. But if we don't achieve them, no harm, no foul. We did our best. People know what their jobs are. Their jobs are to enable those things. If something happens that we don't achieve those goals, what in life is certain? We pursue the Olympics, and sometimes we win the Olympics and it comes to Vancouver in 2010, and other cities, they pursue the Olympics and they don't get it, right? Doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And I think that's the kind of thing we should be looking to government to do, to say, not just like, I'm going to have a list of cool projects. It's like, I'm going to do this for our economy. I'm going to produce, we're going to, export this much more of this, or we're going to open this many more of that. Set the broad policy goals. And then, of course, the civil servants will understand what their objectives are. That these are the directions of government, and my job is to enable these things to happen.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that kind of is outside of the bills, right? This is outside of what these major project bills are. It is enabling the investment community to feel like they have confidence to come back to Canada and to invest in Canada. It's us having sort of broad goals that we're trying to reach, so that the investment community says, oh, they're actually wanting to do these things. It's a cultural shift
almost. Like, we've had 10 years or more of that these weren't important issues. And so, to Carney's credit and to some of the premier's credit, they are trying to shift that culture. But it's going to take more messaging than simply some lists of projects.
And it's going to take a bit more than enacting a single piece of legislation that is broad in scope for sure, but it is hyper-focused on the IAA. It is not focused on these other big issues, such as what it takes to even get to an environmental assessment, and then all of the SHIT that rolls downhill at you after you have gotten your environmental certificate. So I do think we need to think a bit broader in scope. And then, to your point on winners and losers, once the winners and losers are chosen, we need to figure out how we're going to support those people that haven't been put on a list, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to talk about anything else today, Byng, about what's happening with the US or the EU?
Well, listen, This was something we did discuss earlier, and it's less about the major project office, but it is about creating that culture of a nation that can build things and build our natural resource sector, build our infrastructure, and it's related to the Americans exporting their natural gas. Why was there a segment of society that said there wasn't a business case? It's because it was based on an insular Canada-focused perception of the industry, or the economics of that industry. We didn't know that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine. There are other reasons that are outside of impact assessments, outside of the narrow focus of a project, that create reasons to do it. And those things aren't considered. We don't know that our allies may need some natural gas. We don't know there's going to be a conflict elsewhere in the world where people are going to not want to buy Russian gas and they're going to need ours. We don't know, the future of Japan, which isn't an energy producer, which has to import. Which direction are they going to go? Are they going to go to hydrogen? Are they going to is it going to be mixing coal? Are they going to figure out a carbon capture system that's going to change the nature of the system? We don't know. And governments have to, again, back to the winners and losers, have to be very careful about saying, these are the things we won't do. You don't know what the technologies are going to be. You don't know what the geopolitical system is going to be. You don't know how the world's going to change beyond the simple assessment of, say an LNG facility in a specific place at a specific point in time. You have to think bigger. And I think Carney, maybe does understand that, having been around the world, that the criteria by which to judge something is not just the criteria of the time and place, the specific point in time and the specific location. The criteria to judge is much bigger than that. And I think Canada made a huge mistake, in particular when it comes to natural gas, missing an opportunity both for our economic benefit and to the benefit of our allies. Countries that are reliant on unreliable trading partners, on shady regimes. Like, we've abdicated we have other responsibilities. We don't just have responsibility to the environment. We don't just have responsibility to our economy. We have broader responsibilities as global citizens. And I think that all got lost in being parochial and thinking of ourselves and virtue signaling, frankly. And I'm hoping the current leadership of the Canadian government, certainly in some of the province, we're seeing this realization that we are part of something bigger. That's the role of Canada. Our population is not big enough to be the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. Our population is such that we are exporters. We are hewers of wood and drawers of water. We can add value added. By all means, we should be adding value added. But we need to think of these things in a more global context and stop just thinking about our own problems, because these are bigger issues.
If our prime minister went and signed a multi-$100 billion deal with the European Union to export energy, we'd probably build some more energy here in Canada, right?
Create some jobs. Help our friends.
Yes. So these things do have real outcomes. And I think it's important that we do focus some of our energy on how we can be good old global citizens. And I think that's going to be the real leadership that hopefully Mark Carney can bring to Canada.
So here's the challenge, right?
Yes.
Here's the challenge to politicians. I said at the beginning of this is a narrow window, this consensus that we can actually build things in a more timely fashion, and we can do more natural resource projects and more infrastructure projects. I said this was a narrow window. The challenge to our leaders is to make sure that window isn't too narrow. That's
Make
the
sure
challenge.
that in 3 months or 6 months from now, when Trump is still being Trump and things are kind of, you know, quote unquote back to normal, or a new normal, I would say, with some of the tariffs that are happening, that people just kind of decide, oh, you know, we can just go back to what it was before and we'll just be a bit poorer and our economy will just be a bit less, and to just be complacent with that.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that people understand that that does have real impacts on daily life, whether that be through healthcare or education or other things that our public sector spends money on, that we are still a resource economy, and that we, you know, fight to get some of these projects through. And I think it's upon industry also to continue to support Prime Minister Carney and other premiers across this beautiful country to help lift them up, to remind them that this is really important work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, well, thanks everyone for listening to our rant today. Really appreciate you listening to Primary Risk. Please follow us to receive notifications of upcoming episodes wherever you get your podcast. Check out the show notes to references to all of the random things that we talked about today, maybe even a picture of that napkin. New episodes will be released monthly. We're excited to announce our upcoming speaker, so be sure to follow us on LinkedIn to receive news and updates on that. Until the next episode.
Thanks.